Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us tonight for this public event from the Psychedelic Experience Clinic. I'm going to keep the introductions brief, but of course, as always, I ask that you keep yourself muted during the presentation, and afterwards there will be time for questions and a discussion. And as you know, tonight is being recorded. So we have Lawrence Fischman, MD, here with us to speak on illusion and disillusionment, a Winnicottian framework for psychedelic-assisted therapy. Lawrence has been a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst who practiced in the US in New York and Maine for 36 years. In addition to a full-time private practice, he was a clinical instructor in psychiatry at New York Presbyterian, Weill Cornell Medical Center, and later at Tufts University School of Medicine, main track, where he continues to serve on the admissions subcommittee. In 1983, he published a paper in Schizophrenia Bulletin comparing psychedelic drug states with dreams and psychosis. He retired from practice in 2021 to devote more time to reading and writing about psychoanalytic perspectives on psychedelic-assisted therapy. He has published several papers in this field in the past few years and enjoys landscaping and cooking, spending time with his wife, and continues to hate running. He's excited by the emerging possibilities for integrating psychedelic experiences with psychoanalytic-based psychotherapy. Thanks, Larry. Over to you.
Well, thank you for the introduction to me. And I'm going to run fairly quickly through the slide presentation, and the last few slides will be some clinical vignettes, which I'm hoping to spend a little bit more time on. So I'm hoping you can save your questions towards the end, and I'll run through this as quickly as I can. So I'm going to try sharing my screen now, and hope this works. Okay, so my talk today, as Timmy mentioned, is called Illusion-Disillusionment, a Winnicottian framework for psychedelic-assisted therapy, which, to save some time, I'm just going to call PAT from here on in. And I'm going to start with a metaphor, which is bursting the bubble. Bursting the bubble is a phrase which is most often used in economic discussions, but it has also been applied to other situations in which the shattering of an illusion or overly optimistic expectations is a distinct possibility. This phrase has been applied to this recent renaissance we've had in PAT, mainly because of all the media hype surrounding the positive research findings about this treatment. In one sense, I think the bubble already did burst when the US Food and Drug Administration declined to approve the Lycos application for MDMA assisted therapy for PTSD. They cited a need for further evidence to support what it takes to be still unproven claims for efficacy. So we already have had somewhat of a bursting of the bubble. But there may be other reasons that this metaphor applies to PAT. With psychedelic-induced ego dissolution, profound mystical experiences can occur, which engender new insights and beliefs that are often very much at odds with conventional thinking. These can range from changed ideas about nature, about God, life and death, or even about consciousness itself, to inflated ideas of one's own personal capacities, so-called recollections of one's birth process, past lives, and previously unremembered stories or histories about childhood abuse. How should these ideas be addressed in the treatment setting? I suggest thinking about these experiences as what Winnicott called transitional phenomena. This would mean that beliefs which arise from psychedelic experiences should be regarded in the same way that a parent holds a child's transitional object, a process which Winnicott termed illusion-disillusionment. By adopting the same attitude towards the patient's experience that an attuned parent adopts towards her child's transitional object, the psychedelic assisted therapist remains agnostic regarding the objective reality of the patient's experience. If this attitude is born both from curiosity and from compassionate concern, and not just an evasion of an uncomfortable choice, the stage is now set for a patient to explore her beliefs both privately and aloud without external pressure. This renders less threatening for both parties the looming threat of the therapist bursting the bubble, or what might otherwise be experienced as a jarring, deflationary process. You might say that in adopting the term illusion-disillusionment, I'm already betraying a biased view of the patient's experience as a fantasy, and that in accepting the patient's experience, I am, or a therapist would be, acting disingenuously in a way that could cultivate distrust. So to clarify, I use this term, illusion-disillusionment, or illusion itself, to refer to an ongoing process of subjecting one's current beliefs to newer, more encompassing sensory evidence, as Friston articulated in his free energy principle. In this sense, it's assumed that all beliefs are illusions, or at any rate, best guesses or predictions, which are forever being revised in a way that is ostensibly more accurate. Extending this to the psychedelic therapy setting, a therapist who approaches the patient with an illusion-disillusionment orientation is cultivating the same approach in working with the patient's experiences that she would apply towards her own subjectivity. So the issue is not whether or not illusion will eventually yield to disillusionment, but the manner in which beliefs are revised. In what follows, I'm going to discuss how an illusion-disillusionment approach to PAT is well suited for navigating some thorny issues that have been justifiably raised by critics of this therapy, including some potentially adverse treatment outcomes. I will discuss what I call a mode of experiencing during psychedelic-induced ego dissolution. And I'm going to differentiate this mode of experiencing from the insights or ideas which are generated through this mode, which already instantiate the bubble upon which the illusion-disillusionment process is brought to bear. Along the way, my discussion will cross paths in several places with the life of William James. Nowhere in PAT is the issue of bursting the bubble more sensitive and controversial than in referring to so-called transpersonal experiences. The term transpersonal was coined by William James in 1905. While he was teaching a philosophy course, James was trying to defend phenomenalism or idealism from being accused of denying the objective import of experience. He said, and I quote, "It is important in discussion to disentangle certain ambiguities in the word objective as used here. That an idea represents an object may mean that it represents something either transpersonal, as when my object is also your object, or," and he goes on from there, but we'll stop the quote there. So a pretty simple definition: when my object is also your object, or when we both have the same thing in mind. That this simple term was later expanded to represent a wide range of non-ordinary experiences, like Stanislav Grof's definition over here in the slide. And that James is now viewed as a father of transpersonal psychology speaks to the unique way that William James approached phenomena that appear to defy scientific explanation. In other words, there's a good reason I'm turning to William James today and talking about how to approach non-ordinary psychedelic experiences. On this slide is his most quoted statement, which I'll read aloud just because I love it so much. "Our normal waking consciousness, rational consciousness as we call it, is but one special type of consciousness, Whilst all about it, parted from it by the filmiest of screens, there lie potential forms of consciousness entirely different. So he was fascinated by religion and the supernatural, and he brought the same empirical, pragmatic approach to the investigation of religious, mystical, and supernatural phenomena as he brought to the study of psychology and philosophy. His attitude was both open and skeptical, emphasizing the need to accumulate data, but to reserve interpretation, which I think is very important, reserve interpretation. He attended seances, and he believed that, and this is a quote, mediums sometimes revealed knowledge that they could not have known in their ordinary states of consciousness. He recognized that this field was rife with charlatans and frauds, but he wrote in a letter, here's another quote, I believe there is no source of deception in the investigation of nature which can compare with a fixed belief that certain kinds of phenomena are impossible. However, his continued interest in seances and the like subjected him to a lot of ridicule in academic communities. Despite this, James clung to his interest in non-ordinary states of consciousness. And despite his own grounding in anatomy, physiology, and philosophical pragmatism. One theory of why he clung to this interest is that he needed to believe in, quote, something more in order to preserve his own mental health, especially when his philosophical leanings drove him to despair that human beings had no free will. James's conflict about his own faith is reflected in his emotional investment in the spiritual vacillations of his cousin, Minnie Temple. That's his cousin there, and that's her gravestone. As she was dying, James's charismatic father, who was Minnie's uncle, managed to convert her briefly to Orthodox Christianity, but only for a couple of days before she returned to her more familiar and congenial paganism. Towards the end of her life, she wrote about returning back to her paganism. One at least feels that here one breathes one's native air. Welcome back the old human feeling with its beautiful pride and its striving, its despair, its mystery, and its faith. So this was a letter that William James read. And I think William James must have envied Minnie's acceptance and abiding faith in the human condition and in her being able to renounce what ultimately felt to her like illusion, that is Orthodox Christianity, even as she faced her own death. William James's own despair, which was aggravated even further by Minnie's death, and we'll discuss that later, helped him recognize a dynamic relationship between his own need for faith and his sense of powerlessness over his own fate. So we'll talk now about illusion-disillusionment. The process Winnicott calls illusion-disillusionment begins with the mother initially encouraging and then discouraging the infant's sense of omnipotence. Only after allowing a significant period of omnipotence or illusion can successful adaptation to the strain of reality or disillusionment take place. This converges with William James's observation that one's need for belief arises from one's sense of powerlessness over one's fate. The fact that we can control certain things hardly matters. The key point here is simply that a dynamic relationship exists between one's need for belief and the sense of power or control one feels one has or doesn't have over one's objects. For Winnicott, the infant's phase of omnipotence is preceded by an earlier developmental phase in which, here's a quote, maternal care enables the infant to live and develop in spite of his being not yet able to control or feel responsible for what is good and bad in the environment. Good enough maternal care or holding enables the infant gradually to gather, and here's another rest of the quote, gather external factors into the area of the infant's omnipotence, where they are sensed as projections. Winnicott adds, the paradox is that good and bad, what is good and bad in the infant's environment is not in fact a projection. But in spite of this, it is necessary if the individual infant is to develop healthily, that everything shall seem to him to be a projection. This is what Winnicott means in referring to omnipotence as an illusion, sensing something as a projection. Winnicott's understanding of the critical importance of the mother implementing a significant period of infantile omnipotence before allowing gradual disillusionment to take place also informs his theory of psychoanalytic technique with adults. He came to believe that patients in psychoanalysis only benefit from interpretation when, quote, traumatic factors enter the psychoanalytic material in the patient's own way and within the patient's omnipotence. As the second quote in this slide reveals, it took Winnicott himself a very long time of his own practice to realize this. If only we can wait, the patient arrives at understanding creatively and with immense joy. And I now enjoy this joy more than I used to enjoy the sense of having been clever. This last statement also reveals the implicit link Winnicott makes between a sense of omnipotence and creativity. And it can also be taken as a prescription of technique for the psychedelic therapist, meaning, the more we wait, the better things are. Winnicott's formulation, which follows Freud, of the infant's experiencing the breast's arrival at the time of need as a hallucinatory satisfaction of a wish, and therefore as a manifestation of the infant's omnipotence, has always seemed to me a bit forced. It is also at odds with the observations of later infant-mother dyad research, which shows that infants are actually remarkably adept reality testers. If we apply Kohut's self-psychology model, which was, came after Winnicott, so he didn't have that. If we apply that model, the locus of omnipotence, which is in need of gradual abrogation, is the idea of the object's omnipotence, or what Kohut called the idealized parental imago. This slight modification can bring us to the developmental origins of awe. Awe is a hallmark of psychedelic-induced mystical experience and a component of self-transcendent experiences in general. Awe is defined as a feeling of smallness within vastness. It's a definition I like a lot. I discuss it here as a prototype or a core component of the psychedelic-induced transpersonal experiences that are best managed using an illusion-disillusionment approach. Researchers named Keltner and Haidt argue that the primordial form of awe is awe felt towards powerful others. So it's tempting to imagine that such an experience has its roots in the infant's absolute dependency within the infant-mother dyad. So what I'm going to read here is Winnicott's description of the infant state of consciousness during what he called the stage of absolute dependency. In this place, which is characterized by the existential existence of a holding environment, the inherited potential is becoming itself a continuity of being. The alternative to being is reacting, and reacting interrupts being and annihilates. Being and annihilation are the two alternatives. So that, in Winnicott's mind, is the infant's state of consciousness during this stage of absolute dependency. With repeated returns to a continuity of being from being annihilated or on the verge of annihilation, the infant begins to develop the sophistications which make it possible for impingements to be gathered into the area of omnipotence. So here again is why I suggest that the tiny infant experiences omnipotence as residing mainly in the powerful other, who is so often able to restore a sense of continuity of being when the infant is on the brink of annihilation. For an adult, the feeling of awe or the feeling of smallness within vastness may evoke the early drama of being on the verge of annihilation and somehow resuming a continuity of being. During psychedelic-induced ego dissolution, the subject, lacking the capacity to manage impingement, i.e., lacking ego defenses, again sits on the precipice of annihilation. And I have here on this slide, I'll let you read it without my reading it aloud, two examples of people describing their experience of awe on psychedelics. These experiences reflect a heightening of the tension between continuity of being and annihilation, which often marks such states. While nowadays awe usually refers to positively valenced affect, this is actually a recent change in language uses away from its etymology and its original meaning, which connoted a feeling of terror or fear. Today, researchers note that the affect of awe can tilt either towards elation and beauty at one pole or towards terror and fear on the other, which, according to some researchers, may partially explain why the psychedelic experiences can be terrifying or enlightening. This heightening of tension between continuity of being and annihilation, which I think underlies the tension we discussed earlier between omnipotence and powerlessness, may explain the critical need for illusion during and after psychedelic-induced states and transpersonal phenomena in general. Just as holding supports the infant's continuity of being in the face of threatened annihilation by allowing sufficient opportunity for illusion, so in psychedelic-induced states, the therapist's so-called implementation of illusion is made necessary by the proximity of threat, the threat of annihilation. What does it mean to implement the subject's, a Winnicottian term? What does it mean to implement the subject's illusion in PAT? So you can read the first bullet point here, which is a Winnicott quote. So Winnicott used this term to describe how an empathically attuned or good enough mother, this term implementation, that's what I'm referring to, how an empathically attuned or good enough mother responds to the infant's so-called omnipotent expressions. She implements them. I'll let you read the second bullet point here now. The magic that Winnicott refers to lies in the mother's adaptation to the infant's gesture or signal of need. This allows the infant to, quote, believe in external reality, which I think is a startling phrase for Winnicott to use, to believe in external reality. The infant's acceptance of external reality, he's saying, is not a given. It's a belief, a faith that comes to life through the mother's implementation of the infant's expression of need. Very key point here. Where Winnicott sees omnipotence or magical control in the infant's subjective experience of this interaction, subsequent research using video microanalysis reveals how this so-called magical control takes place through affective communication. In other words, Winnicott's so-called gesture and contingent maternal responses. To appreciate all this, bear in mind that Winnicott's infant is all the time on the brink of what he calls unthinkable anxiety. And this is his kind of poetic description of the infant's unthinkable anxiety. Annihilation is already part of the infant's reality. Repeated rescues from the brink allow the infant to believe in a reality in which impingements need not lead to annihilation, a reality in which the infant's signal or gesture leads magically to a continuity of being through interaction with the mother. I think this is what Winnicott means in saying that the mother's successful adaptation enables the infant to believe in external reality. Coinciding with the infant's belief in external reality is a sense of the infant's own reality, or what Winnicott calls her true self, which, as we saw in the last slide, begins to have life through the mother's implementation of the infant's gesture, the infant's signal of its internal state. Winnicott's startling phrase, believe in external reality, allows us to consider what might be called a mode of experiencing. In his paper, Ego Distortion in Terms of the True and False Self, Winnicott discusses two selves, one that feels real and one that doesn't. The spontaneous gesture is the true self in action. Only the true self can be creative, and only the true self can feel real. Whereas a true self feels real, the existence of a false self results in a feeling unreal or a sense of futility. When Winnicott discusses how, through the mother's repeated good enough adaptation to the infant's gesture, the infant's true self begins to have life and the infant begins to believe in external reality, he is describing a quality, a sense, an existential feeling about the infant's experience. What he calls the true self is not some abstract, guarded aspect of identity, but something which is lived, something actively experienced. I suggest understanding it as the mode of experiencing to which the words real and believe both apply. When Winnicott specifies that the mother acts in a way that does not clash with the infant's omnipotence, he's referring to the mother's recognition of the importance to the infant of what the infant believes. Whether or not this is illusion is immaterial. In the PAT situation, belief also plays a critical role. In applying Winnicott's illusion-disillusionment approach to this setting, it's essential that the therapist act in a way which does not clash with the psychedelic subject's belief. To paraphrase Winnicott's observation of the good enough mother, it is on this basis that the psychedelic subject can gradually abrogate illusion. So this is the essence of applying Winnicott's illusion-disillusionment approach to PAT. The therapist remains agnostic regarding the content of the psychedelic subject's belief. She may need to wait a very long time to be able to interpret what the belief means or where it comes from. In the meantime, she must continue through a good enough adaptation to the subject's various gestures to cultivate a therapeutic setting in which the mode of experiencing can feel real. Winnicott applied this illusion-disillusionment approach to the transitional object. In order to, and here's a quote, in order to start each human being off with what will always be important for them, a neutral area of experience which will not be challenged, he suggested the following rule. And you can read it here. I'll read this one aloud. Of the transitional object, it can be said that it is a matter of agreement between us and the baby that we will never ask the question, did you conceive of this, or was it presented to you from without? The important point is that no decision on this point is expected. The question is not to be formulated. In applying this rule to PAT, the therapist never questions whether the subject has created her belief or found it existing in external reality. In simply wanting to know more, the therapist promotes a mode of experiencing in which that which is created feels real. This mode of experiencing is what enables transformation. Here's another quote on this topic from Winnicott. I'll let you read that one. So now we'll get to some clinical vignettes. So I have two and then kind of a third one. and hopefully we'll have some time for discussion. So here's the vignette. A 31-year-old man, who we'll call D, told me about an experience he had about 11 years before while he was taking LSD. At the time, D was living with a couple of roommates, and for a lot of the time also with a young woman, O, with whom he had fallen in love, but who was at the same time in a relationship with a man who lived elsewhere. Things had not worked out for D in college, so he withdrew and felt uncertain about what he was going to do with his life. He took LSD spontaneously one day along with some friends, including O. The trip became quite intense, especially when one of his male friends, who himself had eyes for O, lay next to her on a bed. Sensing D's jealousy, his friend offered to switch places with D, and D, of course, gladly accepted. While he was lying next to O, he began rhythmically stroking a hanging rug draped along the slanted roof over this bed they were lying on. Both D and O were mesmerized by the undulations in the rug caused by D's stroking and by a mandala pattern in its center, from which a pattern of flower petals radiated outward. At one point, with a feeling of sensual energy building up, D placed 4 of his fingers through a hole in the rug. At that very moment, it seemed to D that O exploded into orgasm, and that he himself felt something like an orgasm, though without ejaculating. Crucially, neither D nor O verbalized anything to each other about what they were experiencing. The trip lasted throughout the night, culminating the next morning when someone drew aside a curtain to reveal a world unexpectedly blanketed in glistening snow. The group walked toward a promontory, left this home and walked towards a promontory overlooking the town. As he surveyed the town inhabitants going off to work and their daily chores, D had a novel, somewhat superior sense of, I know, though he could not have said exactly what it was he knew. A few months later, he saw O for the first time since their LSD trip. That night, the night he saw O again, the apartment lights mysteriously flickered on and off, just when D was thinking about their magical moment together and the bursting love he felt for O. Once again, neither party said anything to the other about their feelings. But the next morning, O told D that the severe leg pain she had had the night before had vanished. D took this and the flickering lights as confirmation of the powerful reciprocal love they felt for each other. This was the last they would see of each other for many years, as D felt compelled by circumstances to move back to the town where his parents lived. D felt something quite remarkable had changed in him as a result of this trip, a feeling accentuated by the glistening snow cover, which seemed to have transformed his surroundings, his world, and the light flickering encounter, which seemed to have magically cured O's leg pain. When he ran into O many years later, he finally asked her what she had experienced the night of their LSD trip together. She confided that she had indeed had an orgasm that night. Their conversation generally confirmed what D had long felt about their connection. In the intervening years, D went into psychotherapy, avidly studied philosophy and religion. He thought often about his LSD experience and what it signified. When I spoke with him, he welcomed my questions about his experience, which were structured in a way to help him understand what it meant to him, rather than trying to place it within some kind of theoretical framework. We discussed what it meant to him to believe that O had had an orgasm when he put his fingers through the hole in the rug. Her orgasm signified that she welcomed his love, that it affected her powerfully, meant something very dear to her. The same held true for his wishful thinking the night that the lights flickered. He noted that the energy with which he threw himself into his endeavors after his LSD trip had something of a manic quality. He wondered if this reflected some kind of compensatory effort on his part. It cast his professional career as an outgrowth of what the sensuous rug episode symbolized, an engrossing need to believe he could meaningfully affect the lives of others. This clarification of his feelings about his non-ordinary experience helped Dee arrive at a narrative about his life that made sense to him, without our addressing the nature of the energy or forces that may or may not have been at work during these events. The course of time which elapsed between Dee's LSD trip and his many years later conversation with O had allowed him to work through his illusion himself, preparing him well for some eventual disillusionment. It was reassuring to know that O shared his feelings, but no longer critical to believe they had caused the lights to flicker. So I'm looking at the time. I think we'll have time for the next vignette. So, reset. A 39-year-old man named S mentioned a transformative experience he had had 4 years earlier on MDMA. This took place in an underground therapeutic setting in the home of the guide or therapist. S had recently been given a new academic responsibility, and he was experiencing some performance anxiety, which he hoped to control better. As the drug took effect, S had a vision of his infant daughter, powerfully felt his love for her and her love for him. Suddenly, he was looking instead at his mother and then at his mother's father, both of whom quickly blinked past before, strangely, he, and I quote from him, got to meet my great-grandfather, W., who had rarely even been talked about within S's family. This so-called meeting during the MDMA trip, this meeting took place in Eastern Europe, where W and his young family had lived before the Soviet invasion, which had precipitated their departure from Eastern Europe. S and W discussed why W had pushed his son so hard to be someone in the academic world. This was a topic S had never even thought about before, consciously, though in his psychotherapy, S spent a lot of time thinking about why his grandfather, W's younger son, left his wife and children, including S's mother. The meeting helped S, the meeting with W, the meeting helped S imagine that W displaced his own unfulfilled ambitions, which were crushed by the Soviet invasion, onto his son, who thus felt conflicted between trying to please his father and living his own life. Depicting his grandfather's predicament in these human terms allowed S to sympathize with his grandfather, whose decision to leave his family had caused S's grandmother and mother such great pain. S has always harbored skepticism about paranormal explanations, spiritual explanations, and was taken aback by this vision, which instantly, and I'm quoting him now, instantly shifted my overall sense of what a human mind can do. It allowed him to feel being one with his ancestors and to feel W, and I quote, inside my heart. This vision came to him at a point where he recognized how much he loved his young daughter, and at a point in his career when his new responsibilities weighed heavily on him. As he shared this with me, he imagined how pressured his grandfather must have felt with young children and demands for academic success. He recognized in his grandfather's life a parallel universe in which S unconsciously still lives, dominated by the terror of feeling responsible for keeping his suicidal mother alive. His vision brought him a new narrative, and with it, compassion for W and for his grandfather. It also allowed S to feel some compassion for himself, to accept that while he might not be a so-called superhero, there is much he can do, and that his presence alone is important to others. He is grateful that he sought psychotherapeutic help, which encouraged him to return to his family of origin after fleeing from them earlier in his life. He feels sad for his grandfather, who never got help, did not return to his family, became alcoholic. He wishes he could have gotten to know him. Unlike his grandfather, S has used the knowledge he gained through his transgenerational connection, both to love and to fight his parents, his own parents, in a way that allows him to be himself. In a more recent psychedelic therapy retreat, this one on ayahuasca, S met, in quotes, his grandfather and asked his grandfather directly why he left his family. S said, his grandfather told me that he was a pedophile, and he told me that he didn't know how to be close to my mother without being scared that he would hurt her. As S recalled this meeting in my interview with him, he said it came back to life. I remember we had a struggle where I was not wanting to be close to him, and then eventually I came to a moment of forgiveness. It was like both. It was a moment of letting go, of saying goodbye. And then when I had said goodbye, then I could forgive him. I remember telling him, no matter what you did, I love you. No matter what happened, no matter who you are, you have a place in my heart. It's interesting because the way my mind has this memory, I have this shift where first he looks very stubborn and depressed and harsh in his face. And then after the forgiving piece, then it's like he's finally being able to rest. It's like I have a sense that at first he's hovering over me like a threat or like some demon. And then he kind of comes to a rest and in a way disappears or falls into the background. I then asked, when he was hovering over you like a demon, how did you feel? S responds, when you ask, I think I had already begun to feel relief after a few hours of experiencing myself as this monster, this aggressive sexual monster that has to be imprisoned and has to be controlled. Because if I'm not under full control, then I'm going to lash out and I'm going to kill people or rape people. So I had this huge, what's this word? What's the word? This identification happen where I felt like I was 100% embodying the pedophile part, and I was the pedophile part. And I was really paranoid about letting other people in the room know where I was going and what I was struggling with. And then slowly but steadily, I managed to find myself in all of that and separate from this part. At this point, he told me a new image came to his mind. Here's the new image. I was at the retreat and I went to the bathroom and I sat down and I had this massive, massive breakthrough of grief because in my mind's eye, I had my kids there. But for the first time, I had no anxiety about being nude in their presence. This was like I had the sense, like consciously for the first time at least, that nothing bad is going to happen. It's okay. That was completely unconscious up until this moment. After a pause, I shared a personal anecdote about physical closeness with children. S then mentions, I mean, the interesting thing for me was that I came home and my kids were just wanting to hug me, like infinitely. I didn't tell them anything about what I had gone through. They just felt that I was different because there was no longer that question. To me, it was clear from his description of his kid's reaction that S felt that his transpersonal experience had had a real effect on him. I nodded to S to communicate my tacit acceptance of the subjective reality of his encounter and to indicate to him how remarkable I felt it was that his children could tell he had changed. Um, so I think I'm going to skip this third anecdote, which was a Henry James anecdote, um, and just try to summarize what we've talked about and then leave some time for questions. In each of the vignettes, the subject experiences the content of his experience as real, notwithstanding a simultaneous knowledge of its impossibility under the normal rules of engagement, so to speak. In each case, the content of the vision resonates in some deep way with a true self, inspiring a powerful belief in its meaningfulness. In this mode of experiencing, which is continuous with what Winnicott describes as the place where we live, it hardly matters whether a chain of facts can support the existence of what takes place. A therapist is privileged to have the opportunity to work with such experiences, which creatively embody the key issues in a person's life. As real as these experiences feel, a witness is often necessary to ratify their significance. As S said to me, for me, it's so amazing that with having a listener, that these experiences, they come to life again. They come back in a very colorful way, very powerful. Such so-called transpersonal experiences are necessarily ephemeral. Without a knowing listener, oh, I have a little glitch here. Without a knowing listener, there without a knowing listener, or what William James called the transpersonal dimension of such an experience. In other words, my object is your object. Without that, these experiences do not feel quite as real. But it is in William James's my object is your object notion that the paradox of illusion-disillusionment resides. When you understand my experience, it feels more real to me. It brings it to life. This is what Winnicott means by implementing. This experience of the real facilitates the abrogation of omnipotence, not because an illusion has been ratified, but because a real gesture, an intention, has been understood. When a real meeting of minds takes place, the need for omnipotence subsides. The door opens for considering others' perspectives. Adopting Winnicott's illusion-disillusionment approach to transpersonal experiences leaves open the question about whether the power of D's and O's shared feelings actually caused the lights to flicker or cured her leg pain, and whether S's grandfather actually had pedophilia. One can easily imagine a downside to leaving questions like this untouched, especially, say, if D or S had insisted, which they didn't, that these encounters reveal historical truths. S has considered investigating whether his grandfather was ever suspected within the family of pedophilia, but feels no urgency to do this. Anecdotal reports of tragic outcomes of psychedelic-induced beliefs, including an individual who believed that she was an angel and jumped out of a window. So real problems can happen if these beliefs, when they become delusional, are allowed to go unchecked. As with any treatment strategy, sound clinical judgment and risk assessment must take precedence, including assessing the risk of irrational behavior in relation to a delusional thinking. In a clear-cut case of delusional thinking, an agnostic approach to psychedelic-induced beliefs may be ill-advised. But to be clear, delusionally held ideas can arise quite independently of the therapeutic approach of the practitioner, and most often arise from psychedelic use in the absence of a practitioner. Delusionally held beliefs can, and finally, one reason the illusion-disillusionment approach is less risky than one might think is that most individuals, even many delusional individuals, routinely engage in what Bloiler termed double-entry bookkeeping, whereby context dictates which set of beliefs are acted upon. In general, the advantages of an agnostic approach most often outweigh the risks and speak to the real limits of the psychedelic or other therapist's expertise. We are not arbiters of what is and isn't real. We become much more trustworthy and useful when we practice this. A kid doesn't need to hear that his teddy bear isn't really alive, but he may need someone to help him find it. So,
Thank you so much, Larry. That was
Sure. I'm sorry I haven't
amazing.
left time for questions.
That's okay. I think we've got a little bit of time. Tomislav, do you wanna ask?
No, I was just applauding, not asking yet.
Okay, I see. I'll open up the floor though. Has anybody got a thought or a question that comes to mind? Perhaps not immediately. I've got one of my own. Um, so it really was a fantastic presentation. Yeah, thank you very much for that. Um, of course, I was listening to it as I think that you were intending it to be mainly about working with experiences sort of after the fact rather than during the dosing and being present in that kind of way.
Yes,
But I wondered if you think the same kind of ideas apply to that, um, while the acute
the
experience.
drug session. Yeah. Well, I think as you know, people while they're taking psychedelic drugs are very, very sensitive to their environment and can kind of intuit what feelings people in the room have with them. So the way in which I think this principally works during a drug session is if you are taking this approach to whatever the patient is experiencing, even if the patient hasn't communicated yet anything about what they're experiencing. I think there is, on some intersubjective or intuitive level, some communication about the way you're regarding what they're experiencing. And from time to time, during actual interactions, you may be able to verbalize something of the attitude that you're holding towards their experience, if
Uh,
that answers your question.
yeah, absolutely. And the thing that comes to mind for me off the back of that is perhaps uh, the importance of a kind of transmission of holding, guide to patient, sort of downwards. Um, yeah, and whether it says something about the necessity of experience on the part of the guide. I'll open it up again once more, but I do have another question. But does anybody else have anything? Okay, so what uh, came to mind as well is this idea that um, the omnipotence that needs to be, sort of slowly let go of is not necessarily on the side of the child or the patient, but is sort of located in the other or the environment. And the thing that came to mind was the idea of the transformational object. And I wanted to hear your thoughts about whether this process, this sort of perhaps restoring a belief in the ability of the external reality or mother environment, however we're going to think about it, to transform the experience of the participant child, whether that could be a sort of key mechanism in psychedelic assisted therapy.
Yeah. Well, I'll try to respond. I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but um, you're probably referring to Christopher Bolas's idea of the transformational object, which is derived from the infant's experience of the way being with its mother sort of transforms its 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 whole experience, um, and how afterwards life becomes, in a sense, a search for transformational experiences like that. Um, and so to clarify what I was saying about omnipotence, I think Winnicott harps on a lot about the infant's sort of grandiosity or omnipotence, and speaks as though that's what has to change over time. The infant has to realize that, it is not the center of the universe and does not cause everything to happen. But I think in reality, from an infant's point of view, I don't think the infant experiences himself or herself as being that powerful, especially in relation to its caregivers. And I think it's the caregivers who are experienced as all-knowing and all-powerful. And it's that idea that I think gradually has to be surrendered, relinquished over time, that someone can know what you're thinking and someone, can meet all your needs all of the time. But I think what Winnicott is saying is that in order to believe in reality, we have to believe to some extent that that is true, and that it's over the course of a lifetime that we can gradually accept the idea that these transformational objects are not all powerful. So I don't know if that is exactly what you had in mind or not, but those are some of my thoughts about it.
Yeah, absolutely. This idea that perhaps one can be disillusioned sort of too fast, the bubble burst in that kind of way, leading to a kind of, psychopathology, false self, or however we want to think about it. What I was sort of pointed towards is, could the experience of being in a container and perhaps a sort of, totally regressed state where to, absolute dependence or similar, where the environment really does meet all the needs of the person while they're on the psychedelic drug on a clinical trial or this kind of thing, could be, sort of restoring one's faith in, yeah, the ability of the environment to change, that then later, I think is what you're saying, has to be sort of allowed to be disillusioned once again.
Yeah, I think again, I'm not sure I totally understand, but I think happen. I think that in a state of ego dissolution, that one does experience the object in that way again, in the sense that one is no longer needs or has access to, even if one needs them, to character defenses. Um, so um, so in effect, the object is at that point omnipotent, is all powerful again. Um, and I think the experience of powerlessness, of not having one's defenses, allows one to see that ordinarily one does have one's defenses, and that those defenses are preventing one from sort of acknowledging the regard or the way one feels towards this all-powerful object, including their ideas about oneself.
Uh-huh. Yeah, fascinating. Fascinating.
Yeah,
Thank you.
a little abstract, I guess.
Yeah, it can get that way. I enjoy it personally. I don't know if anybody else has a question, Thomas Love.
Yeah, I have a question about the technique, because Winnicott, in my view, stands for a very like non-directive, and as you also already mentioned, so um, attitude, therapeutic attitude, um, interpretations come very late in the process. So I think he said once that interpretations can also be very violent if they are done too early, and they have to fall from a like from the tree like a ripe fruit or something. And actually, the patient should be the one who provides the interpretation, not the therapist. So it's a certain attitude of a rather passive therapist who's waiting a lot and who's more providing this holding space than doing any really technical interventions or something. It's much more about like the relationship between the therapist and the patient that is cultivated a lot. So not so much maybe the technique. Um, but I'm wondering where's the what is the concrete implication for this, or the consequence for PAT? So how can we create a technique out of this? So it makes sense to think of abiding presence, non-directive therapy, and so on. But at which point, at which point does the therapist become active in a way, or is the ideal therapist a person, PAT therapist, a person who's just passive and serving the patient all the time what he needs actually? So more like a provider of basic needs, or so for me there's some kind of a limitation there, where it's difficult to really make a technique out of this.
Yeah. Well, I think you mentioned the elements of technique in your question about an abiding presence, and empathy and patience, and providing a holding environment, and non-directiveness. So I think all those things are elements of technique. But you probably, I'm maybe projecting my own conflict about this in here. I mean, we spend a lot of time doing psychoanalytic training and learning about the unconscious and how to make interpretations. And are we just supposed to keep silent the whole time and keep these ideas to ourselves? And I think the idea is, for the most part, yes. And I think that's what Winnicott is saying about his own career, that it took him a long, long time to recognize that interpretations are worthless unless they are basically created by the patient's own words. And that he eventually, but not till very late in life, started to welcome the sense of joy he felt at seeing a patient come to their own interpretations more than he enjoyed his own cleverness. So I think there is ultimately an eventual place for interpreting, but only once the patient has reached this formulation virtually themselves.
Yes, I think this makes sense, but maybe to go one step further, for this technique that we have now defined, does it actually need a psychiatrist, or somebody trained in psychoanalysis, or somebody who is very deep in this, or is it also sufficient to have somebody who is able to provide this space and this holding space without all of those trainings and things and intellectual ideas and trainings and abilities that therapists have? Or could it be anybody else, like a psychiatric nurse, or somebody else doing the same work at the same with the same quality at the end, if it's so reduced in a way, you know?
Well, that's a hard question. I'm not sure I know the answer to that, but I first of all would say that it's not just anybody who has these qualities. And I think there are many people who are highly trained who don't have these qualities. So training per se, I think is probably not the critical element here. But a sort of willingness to, as I said, be able to be curious, interested, and direct, and sort of without any memory or desire, without any agenda other than to help the person come to understand their own experience in a deeper way. That as long as that is the guiding attitude in the listener, I think those are the most important qualities, regardless of training.
Dimitri?
Yeah, I just want to say I feel your angst, Tomislav. Like, I've been in practice for many years, and I'm just now struggling with like staying silent and what that means, and how many different types of silences there are. Apparently 32, if you ask a Buddhist. Um, but I wanted to ask, just in general, how well do you think the person sitting with the person who's having the experience should know that person, regardless of training, but how much time should they spend with them? How well should they know them, in your opinion? And just an administrative question, will this be available, the recording, will this be available for later review? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll post it on YouTube.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question again, the first part of it?
Regardless of level of training, how long do you think the person how well should they know, let's say, the patient or the person, however you want to phrase it, the client, before they sit with them?
I think it probably helps quite a bit to know the therapist, and to be able to form an opinion about the therapist's interests and authenticity, if you will. And I think in the second vignette, I mentioned that sometime towards the end of it, I offered a personal experience to S, that I told S something about an experience I had about feeling close or not feeling close to my kids. And that he told me that that meant a great deal to him. And I think that if your question is really about knowing a therapist in the sense of knowing that they're being open and genuine with you when they are, I think that's very important, and that greatly facilitates the process of opening these experiences up in depth. In other words, I think if what you as a therapist can disclose to the person describing their experience reflects your genuine interest in their experience because you're relating something to him or her which is connected with what they're experiencing, I think that can facilitate the process. So if that's part of your question, part of knowing, I think that's important.
No, I apologize. My question was, how well should the guide
Beforehand,
know the patient? Because I've heard that, people have met with the person about to undergo an experience 5 times. Some people have a standardized approach. Some people say that they need to be an analysis. Some people, there's no real kind
uh,
of,
I'm sorry, I
you know,
misunderstood. I thought you were
yeah,
asking the other question.
there's no real guideline for how long you should be working with somebody, but I've seen, they not relative strangers, but you meet twice with somebody and then they do the experience. I've seen 5 times, and I've seen people say, well, you can only do it with somebody that knows you well, has been doing therapy with you for a while, you know.
Um, I think probably both can work at times. I mean, I think even if one has only met with someone a couple of times, that might be enough to establish some sort of framework, some sort of genuine bond that would allow a helpful session like this to take place. Probably the more often one is met, the better, I would think. But
Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, that was.
So we've gone quite a lot over time, and I really appreciate you giving us your time, Larry. It's been really great. I just had one thought off the back of the previous couple of discussions, um, and it's about this question of transference and countertransference and the possible risks of psychedelic therapy. And in my view, one of the most important things is for the therapist or guide to be able to relinquish the projections that, might be quite seductive to believing oneself to be omnipotent, to really want to be the healer, and taking on board some of that process that's happening because of the exposure to the substance and that kind of thing. Yeah, to my mind, that seems the most important thing, for what it's worth. But perhaps we should wrap up there. Thank you so much, Larry. I really appreciate it. We'd love to have you back at some point.
Great. I had fun. Enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you. And thanks for coming, everybody. I hope to see you soon.
Thanks to both of you. Good to meet you all. Bye.
Bye.